We are back, and we are joined now by Thomas Birmingham, a reporter in New Haven who has covered housing and tenants movements in magazines like In These Times, The Appeal, and The Nation, where his latest is published entitled In the U.S., Tenants Are Usually on Their Own. Can a new national tenant union change that? Thomas, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, you open your piece in Montana, in Bozeman, Montana. And we've talked about this a little bit on the show, how when asked about housing efforts, guys like JD Vance will basically say, well, there's so much land in other places across the country, like in Montana, or federal land where we can begin to build homes. But you see, Montana, wide open spaces, it's like 1.2 million, 1.3 million people there, still being exploited by corporate landlords. I guess if you could just talk a little bit about that dynamic and why you chose to begin your piece in Montana.
Yeah, it's really played out exactly as you said. The tenant union in Montana has achieved a lot of really significant wins for a very small city. The founder of the tenant union was actually elected mayor of Bozeman. And they also managed to pass on the city council a whole house short-term rentals ban, all but kicking Airbnb out of the city. And Bozeman in August became one of 5 founding members of the National Tenant Union Federation, which with other chapters in Chicago, Kansas City, Connecticut, and Louisville, Kentucky. And Kentucky is also another great example of one of these places like Bozeman that is in a deep red state, but is seeing an incredible emergence of tenant union organizing that has already managed to land some really substantial victories. And in Louisville, they were able to pass the first ever anti-displacement ordinance in the entire South that will prevent developers from getting tax dollars for projects that push out existing, often historically Black neighborhoods for wealthier residents. So yeah, this is tenant union organizing is really something that is taking off. It's not something that is limited to blue areas by any means.
And in terms of the people that you profile in your piece about the actual organizing efforts, you start with Echo Maker in Montana, and she has never, like the other people that you profile, didn't really have a background in activism, didn't anticipate that they would be organizing on behalf of other tenants, but they've had experiences that drove them to this point. I guess we can start with Echo and how her experience as someone with a disability made her realize that now was the time to organize against the landlords.
Yeah, so the people that I spoke with in this piece are people who have been pushed to the absolute margins of our society. They are disabled, they are low income, many of them are elderly, and they are renters. And Echo Maker is a particularly good example because, yeah, she had absolutely no involvement in political movements. She mentions that the closest she ever came to any organizing was helping out with a parade or her homecoming float in high school. And so these are people who are not engaged in the political process in any way, in large part because the political process has not spoken to them. And the tenant union is oftentimes the first entity that is offering an invitation to these people to say that there actually is a way for you to advocate for yourself, even as the structures in place have relegated you to the margins. And so what the tenant union is, and particularly the Tenant Union Federation, is showcasing is that is a different model of leadership that shows that, Echo Maker mentions in the piece that she took a trip to Washington, D.C. To advocate to the Federal Housing Finance Authority, and they were taken aback when she talked about all of the intersections of her identity, being a single parent, being disabled, being a renter. And so the tenant unit is really providing an avenue for people to unlock some latent political potential in a really transformative way.
And so what are the parts of the housing market that this organizing effort is attempting to challenge in particular?
Yeah, so the tenant unit is really targeting, it's really challenging the basic premise that our housing system operates under on a whole host of levels. It's asking, why is it that, we can allow private equity firms, these massive out-of-state corporations to buy up all these properties, jack up the rent, especially as we saw during the COVID pandemic. Prices went up in those first couple of years, 20-30% in many areas, and are still going up, even at a lesser rate. And so the tenant union is really just creating a avenue to challenge and provide a check against that as it continues to progress, especially with little to no pushback from the federal government. And they're achieving that in many different ways. They're exploring it through social housing campaigns. The Connecticut Tenants Union is one of the chapters of the Tenant Union Federation, and they are really pioneering efforts to find ways for tenants to actually take control of and purchase their properties when they go up for sale. And they also are seeing it at the electoral level. In Kansas City, they've elected many members to the city council. And it's really just getting to the question of, this is a contract that renters have entered. And if the landlord is going to violate the contract by or change the contract in such a way that it becomes, $200 more, $300 more, without making any meaningful repairs in these buildings, then it's only up to the tenants to realize their collective power. And the tenant union and the Tenant Union Federation is already showing how effective that can be in the areas they're organizing.
Right. And so you mentioned in your piece that the TUF, the tenants union, was able to get Biden's ear in the waning parts of his presidential campaign, where he did talk a little bit about taking on these corporate landlords. And it was clear that, he was honestly trying to save his candidacy a little bit, but it was still encouraging to have this out there. If you could explain how that went down with these organizers.
Yeah, so that campaign dates back to 2021, 2022. When they settled on targeting the Federal Housing Finance Authority, which supervises Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and really wants to challenge, how the federal government is actually, inextricably linked from the way that all these massive corporations are buying up so much housing. Most of them have to rely on these loans from the federal government to be able to do it. But because the Federal Housing Finance Authority is controlled by the executive, that gives the executive branch a lot of power to enact reforms in the buildings that these loans exist in, and which would include a federal rent cap in any properties that have loans from Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae. And so this campaign was built around that goal of knowing that this would be a way to do it without having to go through Congress. And we saw Biden offer this in the last couple weeks of his campaign, but insisted that it needed to go through Congress still, even as he enacted several other changes at the FHFA, like changing certain late fee structures and how long tenants have until they get notified of a rent increase. Change that with the executive branch just fine. And then we also saw Kamala Harris take up that call for a rent cap in the first week of her campaign. And then she never mentioned it or brought it up again after that. And it sort of fell to the wayside in favor of policies like, providing subsidies to developers to create 3 million homes.
Yeah.
And, down payment assistance programs. But as my piece sort of gets at, these are not the types of tenants who are on the verge of home ownership. They're on the verge of homelessness. And this is, the Harris campaign really did not speak to any of those tenants and really renters as a class at all. And that's really a shame. Just, in New Haven, where I live, 72% of the population is renters. And so I think housing really, the tenant union is really providing an intervention in, showcasing the kinds of tenants that need to be paid attention to.
Really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much, Thomas Birmingham. The piece is in the Nation. We will link to it below, and then people can find a way to get organized themselves if they are a renter with some of the. It's a good opportunity to have solidarity and to organize for something good that could potentially materially affect your life, especially in these dark days with Trump coming into power. So, Thomas, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Emma.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.